welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we really dig into the sources, the history, the research around a big topic, and try to, distill it down for you, give you that shortcut to being truly informed.
Exactly.
And today we're tackling someone who's both one of history's most profound spiritual figures and, frankly, one of its trickiest historical puzzles, the Buddha. We're going to really try to peel back something like 2,500 years of myth, legend, stories, all the layers to get at the actual person, Siddhartha Gautama.
It's a huge undertaking. You're talking about the founder of a major world religion, an individual who started out, by all accounts, as an aristocratic thinker, a seeker.
Yeah, and that's the core issue, isn't it? That tension you mentioned.
Yeah.
When we talk about the Buddha.
Right, we mean Siddhartha Gautama, but it's absolutely crucial to remember Buddha isn't a name, it's a title.
Okay.
It comes from the Sanskrit root Bud. That means to wake up, to be awake, or to know. So the title literally means the awakened one, or, the enlightened one.
So it's like the ultimate PhD, not the name his parents gave him.
Precisely. His actual given name was Siddhartha, he who achieves his goal. And his family name, his clan name, was Gautama, or sometimes Gautama, in the Pali language.
And there's another name you hear a lot, Shakyamuni.
Yes, Shakyamuni. That's another title, a really important one. It means sage of the Shakyas. It points directly to the tribe, the people he belonged to.
Got it.
So our mission today, our deep dive, is really about grounding these sort of transcendent titles in the actual historical context. We need to look at the time he lived in 6th, 5th century BCE India. Look at the evidence we have, the political landscape, and then try to understand the core philosophy that, surprisingly, seems to hold up across centuries.
I think starting there with the historical reality is key. Because it's so easy just to see him as this timeless symbol, right? But he lived in a specific place, a specific time, a really dynamic, even chaotic era. So let's dive into Chapter 1, the historical context. What was ancient India like back then?
Okay, so Siddhartha Gautama lived somewhere in the 6th or maybe 5th century BCE in South Asia. And this period, it's really significant in Indian history. It's called the Second Urbanization.
Second Urbanization. Meaning cities were growing again.
Exactly. After a kind of lull, the Ganges Basin just exploded with growth. New cities popping up, trade routes buzzing, populations growing, which means, everything's changing. Social structures, economies, it's all in flux.
And that kind of rapid change, I imagine, makes people start questioning things, create space for new ideas.
Absolutely. It's a fertile ground for new philosophies. But it's also important where he was, the middle Ganges region. It wasn't quite the old center of power.
How so?
Well, this area was kind of on the outer fringe, as scholars put it, of the main Aryan cultural influence. The older Vedic culture, very established, was dominant further west. But where Siddhartha was born, among the Shakyas, things were a bit different culturally. The mainstream religious folks sometimes looked down on them a bit.
Interesting. And what about how the Shakyas governed themselves? The stories often paint his father as this great king.
Yeah, the later legends do. But the historical picture seems different. The Shakyas were an aristocratic family, yes, part of the Kshatriya, the warrior or ruling class, but they probably didn't have a hereditary king.
So what did they have?
It looks like it was a small republic, or maybe an oligarchy. It's called a Gasaka. Power wasn't with one person, it was held by a council, maybe elected chieftains. His own father was likely one of these leaders, a Rajan.
Wow, okay. And why is that so significant?
Well, think about it. This kind of local, non-kingly, maybe more egalitarian way of running things. Some scholars think this was the direct inspiration for how the Buddha later set up his own community, the Sangha.
The community of monks and nuns.
Exactly. In the early Sangha, monks had equal rights. Big decisions were often made collectively. It sounds a lot like the political system he grew up in.
A kind of spiritual democracy, mirroring his home turf. And you mentioned they were seen as culturally distinct, maybe even impure, by some traditional Brahmin texts.
Yes, that cultural distance, being on the edge of the mainstream Vedic world, might have given him a certain perspective, a vantage point to later critique things like the caste system.
Right, it sets the stage. Now, what about the religious scene? Was it just the Vedic tradition, or were other ideas floating around?
Oh, it was incredibly vibrant. Maybe chaotic is a better word. This era, sometimes called India's axial age, was just teeming with competing spiritual teachers and schools. It wasn't monolithic at all. It was the time of the shaman movement.
Shrama, what does that mean?
It basically means someone who strives, who exerts themselves for a religious goal. Think ascetics wanderers, renunciates who left ordinary life behind to seek truth. And it was intense. Siddhartha Gautama was actually a contemporary of Mahavira.
The founder of Jainism.
The very same. Jainism was already a major presence, and there were tons of others.
Like what kind of ideas were they debating?
You had all sorts. There were the Ajvikas, who were strict fatalists, believed everything was predetermined. Then you had the Carvaka school, who were total materialists. They were like, no rebirth, no karma, just enjoy this life.
Wow, polar opposites.
Completely. And then there were the Jnana, who were basically radical skeptics, doubting you could really know anything for sure. There's this one Buddhist text, the Brahmajala Sutta, that tries to list them all. It counts 62 different schools of thought.
62. So the Buddha wasn't inventing religion from nothing. He was jumping into this existing, very crowded conversation.
Precisely. His path emerged within that Shiramana landscape. But he offered a specific critique, a reform. He famously rejected the really extreme ascetic practices that many others favored, the crazy fasting, holding your breath until you pass out, that kind of thing.
That's where his middle way comes in.
Exactly. He saw extreme self-denial as just as pointless as extreme self-indulgence. But he was also clever, or perhaps just intuitive, in how he wove in existing local beliefs.
What do you mean? Like things specific to the Shakyas?
Yes. Things that were probably pre-Vedic local traditions, like venerating certain trees. That probably explains why the specific tree he sat under for enlightenment, the pipal tree, became so sacred, the Bodhi tree.
Oh, okay.
And think about local spirits like yakshas and nagas. They find their way into early Buddhist stories and art. Even the practice of building burial mounds, stupas, for relics. That seems to have been a local Shakya custom that Buddhism adopted and made central.
So it's layered. It's a new teaching, but it's built on older foundations.
Yeah.
Which brings us to a huge question. How do we know any of this?
No.
For someone who lived 2,500 years ago, especially when most accounts are religious texts written later, what are the actual historical anchors?
Yeah, that's where the careful work comes in, because you're right, the biggest challenge is simple. We have 0 written records about Gautama from his actual lifetime.
Nothing at all.
Nothing contemporary. His teachings were passed down orally for centuries. It was a really strong, disciplined oral tradition, transmitted in various Middle Indo-Aryan dialects, but still oral.
Okay, so when do we get the first physical proof? The earliest solid evidence that says, yes, this specific person existed.
For that, we have to jump forward quite a bit, but the evidence is undeniable. It comes from the edicts of Ashoka.
Emperor Ashoka, from the 3rd century BCE.
That's the one. Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and he put up these pillars and rock inscriptions all over his massive empire. And some of them talk about the Buddha. The Lumbini pillar inscription is absolutely key.
Why that one?
Because it directly names him Buddha Shakyamuni and explicitly states that Lumbini is where he was born. Ashoka himself visited the site. So here you have an emperor, about 150, 200 years after the Buddha's traditional death date, commemorating his birthplace on stone. That's powerful physical evidence.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a major anchor. Do the edicts tell us anything else?
They do. Ashoka's Minor Rock Edict number 3 is also fascinating for tracking the texts. In it, Ashoka basically tells the monks and nuns, the Sangha, which specific Dhamma texts they should be studying.
So even back then, in the mid-3rd century BCE, there was already a recognized body of teachings, maybe early versions of the Pali Canon.
It strongly suggests that, yes, that the core teachings had already been compiled and were considered authoritative enough for an emperor to recommend them. It points to an established written or at least standardized oral tradition by that time.
Okay, so Ashoka gives us a baseline. What about the texts that tell the story of his life, the suttas? When do they date from?
Well, the earliest layers of the canonical texts, like the Pali Suttas, particularly the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, the one about his death and final days, they contain some very old linguistic material. Some scholars argue parts of it could go back as far as 350 to 320 BCE.
That's surprisingly early, less than a century after some proposed death dates.
It is. It suggests a pretty strong historical memory, even if compiled by his followers. But the oldest actual manuscripts we found, those are the Gandharan Buddhist texts written on birch bark. They date from maybe the 1st century BCE up to the 3rd century CE.
So there's still a gap. And this is why we have to be careful distinguishing the early layers from the later, more legendary stuff.
Precisely. The really famous full biographies like the Buddha-Karita, written by Ashvaghosha probably in the 1st or 2nd century CE, or the Lalita Vistara Sutra a bit later. These are the ones that bring in all the elaborate stories, the miracles, the drama, like his battle with the demon Mara under the Bodhi tree.
Those are important religious texts, obviously, but for history.
For history, scholars tend to trust the earlier, often drier, more fragmented accounts found in the Pali Suttas and their parallels in other early canons. They seem closer to the ground.
Okay, let's take that more historically grounded approach now and look at the actual life story. Chapter 2, The Life of Siddhartha Gautama.
All right, starting with the basics, birth and family. The tradition is very strong. He was born in Lumbini, which is in modern-day Nepal, and he grew up nearby in Kapilavastu.
Now, Kapilavastu, is its exact location settled?
Still a bit debated, actually. There are 2 main candidates, Piparwa in India and Tilarakot in Nepal. But they're really close, only about 24 kilometers apart. So it confirms his home territory was that Shakya Republic, right on the borderlands as we know them today.
And his father, Suddhodana. We already touched on this, but the popular image is the protective king building walls to hide suffering.
Yeah.
Because of prophecy, right?
Yeah, the prophecy story is big in the later legends that seers predicted he'd be either a world ruler or a world renouncer. So Dad tried to force the first option. But historically, Suddhodana was likely, as we said, an elected chieftain or oligarch, a Rajan in their republican system, not this huge hereditary monarch.
So still privileged, but maybe not quite the fairy tale palace.
Definitely privileged. He was Kshatriya, aristocratic. And the early texts do confirm key details. He was married, his wife's name usually given as Yashotara. They had a son, Rahula. And he himself said later that he'd lived a very spoiled life. Lots of comfort, luxury, shielded from harshness.
Which makes his decision to leave it all even more striking. What was the catalyst, according to those earlier, more historical-leaning texts?
This is a really interesting contrast. The early accounts frame it as a deep, internal, almost philosophical crisis. The Buddha is quoted remembering how the realization hit him, that life inevitably involves old age, disease, and death. This fundamental insecurity, this dukkha, made the comforts of home feel impure, constrained. He wanted the free open air of the seeker's life.
So it starts with an existential realization, not seeing specific suffering people.
That seems to be the older version, the famous foresight story, seeing the old man, the sick man, the corpse, and then the peaceful ascetic that appears to be a later, very powerful literary way to explain the why. It dramatizes the decision, the great departure, the Mahāabhinishkrama, where he supposedly slips away from the palace at night.
It's a better story, maybe, but the earlier version feels more intellectually driven.
It does. Both explain the departure, but one emphasizes inner realization, the other external shock. Once he left, though, he didn't just wander aimlessly. He sought out teachers.
Right, he went looking for answers from established masters. What did he learn?
He was apparently a very gifted student. He trained under several well-known yogic teachers. The most famous mentioned is Udraka Ramaputra. Under him, Siddhartha reportedly mastered incredibly advanced meditation states, reaching what's called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception.
That sounds pretty high up there. Why wasn't that the answer for him?
That's the absolute key turning point. He achieved these profound states of concentration, these altered states of consciousness, but he realized they were still temporary. They were escapes, perhaps, but not liberation. They didn't lead to Nibbana, the end of suffering, the ultimate awakening. They were still, in a subtle way, part of the cycle of conditioned existence.
So dissatisfaction again, which led him, where? To the other extreme.
Exactly. He seems to have thought, okay, if refined meditation isn't it, maybe extreme physical discipline is. This led to his phase of intense asceticism.
This is where the stories of him barely eating come from.
Yes. The texts describe him practicing extreme self-mortification, eating maybe 1 grain of rice a day, holding his breath, pushing his body to the absolute limit. He described himself looking like a skeleton.
And that didn't work either.
He realized it was just another dead end. It led to physical weakness, maybe delirium, but not insight. It was just as unbalanced as the palace life. This near-death experience seems to be what finally broke the spell. He realized the path wasn't about indulgence or punishment.
The middle way emerges from this low point.
Precisely. He decided to accept some food. Famously, the story involves a woman named Sujata offering him milk rice pudding. He regained his strength. And then came the crucial insight.
What was that?
He remembered an experience from his childhood. Just sitting under a tree, he'd naturally entered a state of calm, focused awareness, a state of dhyana, effortless concentration. And he thought, that felt wholesome, that felt right. Not forced suffering, not chasing pleasure, but this balanced, mindful presence combined with basic physical health.
So he finds a spot under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya and decides, this is it.
He makes a vow, basically, not to get up until he finds the answer. And according to the tradition, that night was the culmination of his quest.
What actually happened during that enlightenment experience? The text describes stages, right?
They do. It's depicted as a sequence. First, achieving deeper and deeper states of meditative absorption, the 4 dhyanas. Then gaining what are called the 3 higher knowledges.
Okay, what are those?
First, remembering his own past lives, countless lifetimes. Second, the divine eye, the ability to see how karma works, how beings are reborn according to their actions. And third, the most important one, the complete extinction of the mental intoxicants, the asavas.
The intoxicants, like greed and hatred.
Greed, hatred, delusion, the deep-seated defilements, the cravings and ignorance that keep us trapped in samsara, the cycle of rebirth. Destroying these meant achieving full liberation.
And this state is the understanding of the 4 noble truths.
Yes, that direct, unmediated insight into the nature of suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path leading to that cessation that is enlightenment, that is the realization of the middle way, which gets mapped out practically as the Noble Eightfold Path.
After achieving this profound state, did he immediately start teaching?
Interestingly, the texts say he hesitated. He felt his realization was so subtle, so deep, would anyone else possibly understand it? It's a very human moment.
So what changed his mind?
Well, the traditional story brings in the god Brahma Sahampari, who appears and basically begs him to teach for the sake of the world. Whether literal or symbolic, the point is, he decides to share the path.
And who did he seek out first?
His 5 old buddies, the ascetics he'd practiced with before. He knew they were dedicated seekers. He found them in the deer park at Sarnath near modern-day Varanasi.
And delivered the first sermon.
Delivered the first sermon, often called Setting the Wheel of Dhamma in Motion. And right there, one of the 5, Kandinya, reportedly had a breakthrough and became the first arhat, a fully liberated disciple. And that moment, that first teaching and first awakening among his followers, that's the birth of the Buddhist saga, the monastic community. It grew quickly from there.
Okay, so we have this compelling life story grounded in the early texts. But let's circle back to the physical proof. Beyond Ashoka's pillars from the 3rd century BCE, is there any archaeological evidence that potentially dates closer to the Buddha's actual lifetime, say the 5th century BCE?
That's the million-dollar question for archaeologists. There are a couple of key sites that are particularly relevant here, although dating that far back is always tricky.
What's the first one?
Probably the relic stupa at Vaishali in Bihar. It's widely considered the earliest known stupa. Excavations revealed a simple clay core that seems to predate the Mauryan period.
So older than Ashoka.
Likely, yes. And significantly, there's evidence that relics were removed from it later. This fits perfectly with the tradition that Ashoka opened up the original 8 relic stupas and distributed the Buddha's remains more widely across his empire. So Vaishali gives us a plausible glimpse of that very early post-mortem veneration.
That's pretty compelling. It connects the structure to the stories. What about Lumbini, his birthplace? Anything there that might be super early?
This one is more debated, but potentially very significant. Underneath the later Mayadevi temple at Lumbini, archaeologists found remains of a wooden structure.
Yeah.
Some of the charcoal associated with its post holes was carbon dated, and some dates came back possibly as early as the 6th century BCE.
Wow, that would put it right in his lifetime. But you said it's debated.
Yes, the dating context is complex, and not all scholars are convinced it definitively proves the structure itself is that old or directly related to the Buddha. But what it does show is very early ritual activity and building at the traditionally recognized birthplace, certainly within the general period he would have lived. It adds weight to the site's authenticity.
So suggestive, if not quite a smoking gun. What about early art? We talked about Ashoka's inscriptions, but are there other early depictions or references?
Absolutely. A really important piece is the Barfoot Stupa railing, dated around 100 BCE. It has reliefs depicting scenes related to the Buddha, but importantly, it also has inscriptions.
What do they say?
One inscription, right next to a depiction of the Bodhi tree and an empty throne, reads, Bhagavato Sakamuni no Boto.
Which means?
The illumination, or the awakening of the Blessed Sakamuni. Sakamuni being Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakyas. So here, just a few centuries after his life, you have his stone carvings explicitly linking his title, his clan name, and the event of his enlightenment to a specific symbol, the Bodhi tree. It's concrete proof of established worship practices.
That really bridges the gap between the historical figure and the emerging religion.
Okay, let's talk texts again. You mentioned the oral tradition was strong. Why are scholars so confident in the core message being preserved accurately across different regions and languages?
It comes down to consistency and coherence. The core teachings, the Vinaya, which is the monastic rulebook, and the Sutta Pitaka, the discourses attributed to the Buddha or his direct disciples, were memorized and chanted communally, rigorously for centuries.
A standardized curriculum, almost.
In a way, yes. And they were transmitted in various related Middle Indo-Aryan dialects. Later, these oral traditions were written down in different places: Sri Lanka for the Pali Canon, Gandhara for other texts, eventually leading to translations into Chinese, Tibetan, etc.
And when scholars compare these different versions preserved thousands of miles apart, they find remarkable agreement on the fundamentals. The core analysis of reality, the Four Noble Truths, the idea of dependent origination, how things arise based on conditions, the breakdown of experience into the five aggregates, this basic philosophical framework, is surprisingly stable across traditions like the Pali Canon, the Chinese Agmas, the surviving Gandharan fragments.
Which suggests what?
It strongly suggests that these core ideas likely originated from a single, powerful, coherent source, a historical founder. It's harder to explain that level of consistency if it all just randomly evolved in separate places. The structure holds together.
Okay, so the general scholarly view is, yes, he definitely existed. But there's still debate about the exact dates, right? You mentioned a long chronology and a short chronology.
That's right. It's an ongoing discussion. The long chronology is often based on sources preserved in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, and it places his death, Parinirvana, around 486 or 483 BCE, meaning he lived roughly 566-486 BCE.
Okay, and the short?
The short chronology puts his death about a century later, maybe around 380s or even 360s BCE. This is based more on reconciling Indian king lists and synchronisms with Greek sources. Many modern historians lean towards this later dating, perhaps around 448-368 BCE for his life, or somewhere in between.
Why does 100 years matter so much?
It affects who his contemporaries were, how quickly Buddhism spread, and how we interpret certain archaeological finds. But honestly, the exact date isn't the main point for most historians anymore.
What is the main point then?
The overwhelming consensus is that there was a historical figure named Siddhartha Gautama who belonged to the Shakya clan, lived and taught in northeast India during the Mahāyāna period, the era of these emerging kingdoms and republics, and was a contemporary of Mahavira, the Jain founder. Whether he died in 486 or 386 BCE, that core reality is widely accepted.
Got it. And the debate has shifted more towards which specific teachings can be traced directly back to him versus maybe slightly later developments.
Exactly. That's where the nuance comes in. Everyone agrees the core liberating insight originates with him. But some scholars argue that maybe the very precise formulations we have now, like the exact 12 links of dependent origination, or the perfect structure of the Four Noble Truths as presented in textbooks, might have been slightly refined or systematized by the early monastic community.
As a way to explain and transmit his core message.
Precisely, to provide a clear philosophical framework for that initial, powerful insight. It doesn't mean the ideas aren't his, just that the exact wording or structure might have evolved slightly in the first generation or two after him. But the general outline of his life, his quest, his core message, that's considered historically solid.
All right, let's pivot now to what he actually taught, because that's where his historical impact really explodes. We have to start with the absolute bedrock, dukkha and samsara.
Right. You can't understand the Buddhist message without understanding samsara. This is the endless cycle, birth, death, rebirth. He taught it's perpetual, going on and on with no discernible beginning. And the defining characteristic of this cycle is dukkha.
Which usually gets translated as suffering, but you said it's broader than that.
Much broader. Suffering is part of it. Yes, physical pain, emotional pain. But dukkha also means unsatisfactoriness, unease, stress, the inherent instability of conditioned existence. It's that friction we feel because we want permanence, security, lasting happiness from things that are, by their very nature, impermanent and unable to provide that ultimate satisfaction.
And his analysis of why things are unsatisfactory involves breaking down our experience, right? The five aggregates, the six sense bases.
This is where he gets really analytical, almost like a psychologist. He says, all our experience comes through the doors of the six senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and significantly, the mind itself is a sense organ that perceives thoughts and emotions. And What we perceive, what we call reality or myself, is actually made up of 5 constantly changing clusters or aggregates, the standas. These are form, our physical body; feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sensations; perception, recognizing and labeling things; mental formations, volitions, intentions, habits, biases, the active stuff; and consciousness, basic awareness of an object.
So these 5 things are what make up me.
Kind of, but the crucial point is they aren't solid things. They are processes. They're constantly arising, changing, and ceasing moment to moment. Like watching a river, it looks like one thing, but it's always flowing, always different. There's no fixed entity there.
And that leads to his most radical idea, anatta, no self.
Exactly. This was revolutionary. Most Indian systems at the time believed in some kind of permanent soul or self, the Hindu Atman, the Jain Jiva. The Buddha looked at these 5 aggregates, these processes, and said, look closely. Is any one of these permanent? Is any one of them truly you or yours in an ultimate sense?
And the answer is no.
The answer is no. Because they're all impermanent, they're all dependent on conditions, they're all ultimately stressful if clung to. Therefore, none of them can be identified as a permanent, unchanging core self. The self, he taught, is more like a convenient label, a story we tell ourselves based on this shifting collection of processes. Believing in a fixed, solid self is the root cause of our clinging, our fear, and ultimately our dukkha.
Wow. Okay, so if the problem is this clinging to an illusion of self within the cycle of samsara and dukkha, what's the solution? What's the path out?
The path out is the path he discovered, the middle way, which is laid out practically as the Noble Eightfold Path. It's a gradual training, a process of transformation. It involves cultivating sila, which is ethical conduct, non-harming, honesty, right speech, etc. Basically cleaning up your act.
That's the foundation.
That's the foundation. Then comes samadhi, concentration or mental discipline, which involves training the mind through practices like mindfulness, lati, and meditation to become calm, focused, and aware.
Okay, ethics and mental training. What's the third part?
Panna, wisdom, or insight. Through ethical living and a calm, clear mind, you begin to see reality directly as it is, impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without a fixed self. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. This insight is what cuts through ignorance. The whole path aims at destroying those deep-seated fetters and intoxicants, asava, as we talked about, leading to liberation, vimutti, or nibbana.
This whole philosophy, it wasn't just for monks meditating in caves. It had major social implications, didn't it? Especially challenging the Brahmins and the caste system.
Oh, absolutely. It was a direct, head-on challenge. He completely rejected the divine authority of the Vedas, which was the bedrock of Brahminical power. He condemned animal sacrifice, a central Brahmin ritual, and most radically, he denied that caste, your birth, determined your spiritual potential or your inherent purity.
How did he argue that?
He basically said, it's not about who your parents were, it's about how you act. He asserted a universal moral law, the Dharma, that applied equally to everyone. Being a true Brahmin, he argued in some suttas like the Vasetta Sutta, wasn't about lineage. It was about living ethically, cultivating virtue. He judged people by their conduct, not their birth certificate.
And this was reflected in who could join his community.
Yes. The Sangha was, in principle, open to people from all castes. Once you ordained, your previous caste identity was supposed to be irrelevant. This was incredibly radical for its time.
Beyond the social critique, did he have anything to say about politics? About how rulers should behave? He came from a ruling family, after all.
He did, which is interesting for someone who renounced worldly power. He advised kings and chieftains. He developed this ideal of the Kakavati, the wheel-turning monarch.
What does that mean?
This wasn't just a conqueror. A Kakavati was supposed to rule ethically based on dharma, not just force. And crucially, their primary duty wasn't just defense, but ensuring the welfare of the people, especially the poor.
Why the focus on the poor?
Because he saw a direct link between poverty and social unrest. There's a famous text, the Kakavati Sehanada Sutta, where he basically lays out how a king neglecting the poor leads directly to theft, then violence, then the complete breakdown of society. So providing economic security was seen as essential for maintaining peace and morality. It's a surprisingly pragmatic, almost modern-sounding political ethic.
And you mentioned his preference for the Republican style of government within the Sangha, mirroring his own clan structure.
Yes, that egalitarian model with collective decision-making and no single appointed successor after his death seems to reflect the Gasa ideal he grew up with. It suggests a preference for less centralized, more participatory forms of governance, at least within his spiritual community.
It's fascinating how these ideas spread. Buddhism exploded across Asia, but ironically faded in India itself eventually.
It's one of history's great puzzles. Buddhism flourished in India for over 1,000 years, but then gradually declined, mostly after the 8th century CE or so. The reasons are complex shifting political patronage, the rise of devotional Hindu traditions, maybe internal factors too. But as it declined in India, it was taking deep root elsewhere.
Southeast Asia, East Asia, splitting into different schools like Theravada, Mahāyāna, Vajrayana.
Right. But what's remarkable, despite all that diversity and geographical spread, is how much of that original philosophical core remained intact. If you look at the earliest texts preserved in Pali, in Chinese, in Tibetan, even those early Gandharan fragments, the fundamental analysis of reality, the aggregates, the sense bases, dependent origination, they are recognizably the same system. It points back to that powerful, coherent beginning.
So let's talk about that legacy. How did this Indian sage, who lived and died 25 centuries ago, become such a global figure? Let's start with how people even depicted him. It wasn't always statues, was it?
Not at all. For the first few centuries, there seems to have been a strong tradition of not depicting the Buddha in human form. It's called aniconism.
Aniconism. So how did they represent him in art?
For symbols. In the earliest art we have, from places like Bharhut and Sanchi, maybe 2nd, 1st century BCE, you see scenes from his life. But where the Buddha himself would be, there's an empty throne, or footprints, or the Bodhi tree, or the Dharma wheel.
Why? Out of respect.
That seems to be the idea. Perhaps suggesting that someone who has attained Nibbana, gone beyond conditioned existence, couldn't or shouldn't be represented by a limited human image. He was transcendent. It was only later, maybe around the 1st century CE, possibly influenced by Greek art in Gandhara, that human form Buddha statues started becoming common.
And then, especially with the rise of Mahāyāna Buddhism, the understanding of who or what the Buddhas also shifted dramatically.
Hugely. In Mahāyāna philosophy, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama or Shakyamuni, comes to be seen as just one manifestation, one earthly appearance of something much vaster.
Like what?
Like a cosmic, eternal, ultimate reality, sometimes called the Dharmakaya, the truth body of the Buddha. From this perspective, Shakyamuni's birth, his life, his enlightenment, even his death, these aren't the endpoints of a finite being. They're more like skillful performances, upaya, appearances conjured up by the ultimate Buddha reality to teach and inspire beings according to their needs. The real Buddha is timeless and everywhere.
That's a massive philosophical leap from the historical teacher.
It is. It opens up a whole different cosmology. But the influence of the original story, the historical Siddhartha's life, was so powerful it even seeped into other religions in surprising ways.
You mentioned Hinduism incorporating him.
Yes, in many Hindu traditions, the Buddha came to be seen as the 9th avatar or incarnation of the god Vishnu. This probably happened gradually as Buddhism was declining in India. It's complex, maybe a way of absorbing a powerful rival, maybe acknowledging his importance while fitting him into their own system.
But the really wild story is the connection to Christianity. St. Josaphat.
Isn't that amazing? The story of Barlaam and Josaphat was hugely popular in medieval Christianity, East and West. Josaphat is this Indian prince, sheltered from suffering, who eventually encounters old age, sickness, and death, renounces his kingdom, and becomes a holy man under the guidance of the hermit Barlaam.
That sounds familiar.
It's the Buddha's life story. The name Josaphat actually traces back linguistically through Arabic and Persian versions, Yudasaf or Buddhasaf, ultimately to the Sanskrit word bodhisattva.
No way, so a bodhisattva became a Christian saint.
Effectively, yes. The story traveled along the Silk Road, got adapted, names changed, but the core narrative is unmistakably Siddhartha's journey. He even ended up in the official list of saints in some traditions. It just shows the incredible reach and resonance of that original quest.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Okay, fast forward to today. Why are these teachings, developed 2,500 years ago in a completely different world, still relevant? What are people getting out of them now?
Well, the core path is timeless in many ways. The emphasis on bhavana, mental cultivation, developing wholesome qualities. The practice of sati, mindfulness, which is obviously huge today, even in secular contexts. And sila, ethical living, the 5 precepts for lay people, are still a basic moral guide for millions.
And the philosophy itself, the no-self idea.
Modern interpretations often really connect with the psychological insights. Seeing the self not as a fixed thing, but as an ongoing process, anatta, can be incredibly liberating for people struggling with ego issues or anxiety. Understanding karma primarily as intention, and seeing how our own minds create our reality that resonates strongly with modern psychology and even some strands of cognitive science.
But it wasn't just about deep philosophy or escaping rebirth. Did he give advice for just living a good life here and now for regular folks.
Absolutely. He wasn't just teaching monks aiming for nibbana. There are many suttas aimed squarely at lay followers, advising them on how to achieve worldly happiness, sukha.
Like what kind of advice?
Really practical stuff. In the Digaju Sutta, for example, he talks about the importance of good friendship, kalyamitata, working hard and being skilled in your profession, lanta sampada, protecting your wealth, araha sampada, and living within your means, samajjivikata. It's very grounded advice for well-being in this life.
And is there one text that really sums up his advice for social harmony?
Probably the Sigalovada Sutta. It's sometimes called the layperson's code of conduct. It's remarkable. It lays out the mutual duties and responsibilities within 6 key relationships: parents and children, students and teachers, husband and wife, friends and companions, employers and employees, and lay people and religious guides.
Wow, a blueprint for a functional society. What kind of duties does it mention, say, between boss and worker?
It's quite specific. Employers should assign work according to ability, provide fair wages and food, care for workers when they're sick, share special treats, and give reasonable time off. Employees, in turn, should be diligent, honest, obedient, and start work before their boss and finish after. It emphasizes mutual respect and responsibility.
That sounds incredibly relevant even today. It seems like the enduring power comes back to that ethical core, that sense of fairness and equality he championed.
I think that's absolutely right. His insistence on a universal moral code, judging people by their actions, not their birth, offering a path to betterment open to anyone through personal effort, that was revolutionary then, and it still offers a powerful ethical vision for today's world, cutting across cultures and times.
It really is amazing. You start with this historical figure, an ascetic prince from a small republic on the edge of India, and his ideas ripple out to shape philosophy, culture, art, and individual lives across millennia and continents.
It's an incredible trajectory. The Buddha figure is complex. He sits right at that intersection of documented history and profound philosophical insight. He came out of that vibrant, competitive Shramana world, but he didn't just continue it. He fundamentally redefined the goal and the path. He argued that liberation wasn't about extreme practices or divine favor, but about cultivating clarity, wisdom, and compassion within your own mind.
And the consistency of that core message, preserved across time and traditions, is really the bedrock of his historical legacy.
It really is. Despite all the later embellishments and shifts in interpretation, that fundamental analysis of the human condition and the path to its resolution remains remarkably coherent.
So reflecting on all this, we've traced Siddhartha Gautama from a possible chieftain's son to the awakened one, the sage of the Shakyas. We've seen how the story itself evolved, how historical fact blended with legend and cosmic significance, which, in a way, perfectly illustrates one of his own central teachings. The Buddha's very last words, according to the texts, were reportedly, "All sankaras decay, strive for the goal with diligence." Sankaras meaning all conditioned things, all compounded phenomena, everything.
Everything is impermanent.
Exactly. And we've just spent this whole deep dive exploring how even the story about the Buddha, the historical details, the biographies, they themselves are sankars. They decayed, changed, were reinterpreted over time. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. If even the accounts of the awakened one are subject to impermanence, how do we apply that profound realization that everything changes, everything decays to our own lives, and maybe even to our own search for truth and understanding today? How do we strive diligently, knowing that the ground is always shifting beneath our feet?